Those who are young and those who are young at heart. Our scripture lesson this morning is from Matthew's Gospel. We're spending a good deal of time here in Matthew's Gospel. It's on page 970 in your Pew Bible, if you'd like to follow along. We are reading Matthew chapter 14, verses 13 through 33. And as a little bit of a background before this verse, John the Baptist has been arrested and beheaded by Herod. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so that they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." Jesus replied, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." "We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," then he answered. "Bring them here to me," he said. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. During the 4th watch of the night, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. And Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You have little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. It's water. Or at least it looks like water. Okay. I wasn't there when this actually happened, but some friends of ours at a church that we served told about an incident in which they had been doing this annual Thanksgiving dinner. And when they started it out, it started out really small. I think they had maybe 16 the first year, and then about 20 the next year, and they started building up. And the idea was to provide meals for people who otherwise may not have a Thanksgiving meal. And it eventually became a community thing, largely aimed again at people that needed, the kids would have free reduced lunches and that sort of thing. And it began growing fairly steadily. And after a few years, it had built up to 100 meals. They were serving 100 meals to these neighborhood families. And so the next year they figured, well, it's going to grow, so they planned for that. But they didn't plan for enough because it jumped in 1 year from 100 to 300 families. 300, well, individuals, right? 300 individuals. And they had not planned for that many. They simply didn't have enough food. And they decided, well, you know what? We know we're doing the right thing. We know what we're supposed to be doing. They prayed over it. And then they decided that when they ran out of food, they would just have to tell people, "I'm sorry, we don't have any more." And the most amazing thing happened. They didn't run out of food. They didn't run out of food. In fact, they had a little bit left over. Now, I know these people. They're good people. They're faithful people. They're salt of the earth kind of people. I was going to say they're as sane as you or I, but there's been some doubt cast on me by the choir back here, so that's okay. That's okay. We're all in this together. Something happened. They didn't plan with the resources that they had for who showed up. Great multitude. I imagine that must have been something like what the disciples were going through in their minds. When this great crowd gathers, they gather around the town. Now understand, they're in the area called Galilee. And in the middle of Galilee, or around this section, it's communities that have gathered around the Sea of Galilee, which really isn't much of a sea. It's really more like a good-sized lake. You can see the other side. It's not that big. And it's short enough that they can go from the surrounding towns to the opposite side of the lake where Jesus has gone. And he's been healing them and taking care of their diseases and so forth, and they gather around him, even though he's kind of trying to get away from things because of what's happened to John the Baptist, that he sees them though, and he has compassion. They've come all that way. They have walked to the other side of the lake. And so he heals them. And, the disciples are saying, wow, there's a lot of people here. There's a lot more than what we planned for. We were thinking 12, maybe 13. And so they say to him, let them go to the other towns so that they can feed themselves. And Jesus said, they don't have to go anywhere. You feed them. And I imagine they were probably standing there with these couple of fish and 5 loaves of bread. I think it's Luke's gospel that tells us that they got those from some kid that was hanging around. And they're like, well, that's certainly not going to be enough. And Jesus says, give them to me. And so they took what they had, and they give it to Jesus, and Jesus prays and blesses it and breaks the bread. That's it. And it's not Jesus. I mean, our Bible says that Jesus feeds the 5,000. Jesus didn't feed the 5,000. The disciples fed the 5,000. They brought what they had to Jesus. Jesus blessed it, and then he sent them out to feed a crowd of people. Now it says 5,000, but really there's more than that there. Because it's 5,000 men plus women and children. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that it's not 5,000, but maybe at least twice that. Maybe it's 12,000 people, like we're getting ready to feed with Rise Up Against Hunger. Maybe it's 12,000 people. 1,000 for each disciple. Each of the 12. Wow. I see how much food's involved with our Wednesday night suppers, and we only have 50. Can you imagine 20 times that much? Henrietta's about ready to fall over back there. Because she goes to Sam's and picks up the food. And yet when they get done with this, when they have entrusted what they have to Jesus, there is more than enough. We're told that after this meal, they go through and they collected baskets, 1 basket full for each of them, loaded up with food after everything is done. Now they only started out with 2 fish and 5 loaves. And when they get all done with it, they have much more than that. Even after giving everything out. Later, Jesus sends the disciples in a boat. And by the way, they've recovered one of these boats from the time, a fishing boat, from about the time of Jesus in Galilee. And the boat really, it's almost the length of our altar here. It's about that same length, maybe a little bit longer, but not by much. And the thing about the Sea of Galilee, like I said, it's a small lake, really, is that geographically it's in a bowl. There are mountains on all sides. It's really like somebody scooped out a bowl and put some water in there. And what happens is when the wind comes in, especially from a certain direction, it gets the waves to just start going across there. It's not just choppy, but they are big waves in this sea. It's a very dangerous thing. And the disciples are in the midst of all of this. Jesus has dismissed the crowd. He's gone and gotten some prayer time to himself. And they see him walking across the water. Now, can you imagine? You're in a boat that's about this big. The waves are huge. And can you imagine, how would you feel? You'd be scared to death, wouldn't you? I mean, the anxiety and the adrenaline is going, and all of a sudden you see somebody walking out on the lake. What's your first impression? Well, we've all died. It's a ghost. The rest of us will be following shortly. And that's what they say. It's a ghost. He says, take courage. In the midst of all of this going on, the guy walking on the water, waves going all over the place, a little boat getting tipped and tossed all around. Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. And Peter, impetuous Peter, says, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come out on the water. And Jesus says, come. He doesn't ask Peter, by the way. He doesn't ask Peter. He commands Peter. It's the imperative sense. It's a come. It's like what you say to a child. Come here. Get that out of your mouth. Whatever. Come. And so Peter answers that call. He gets up out of the boat, gets onto the water, and starts walking across that. Oh my gosh. The waves are still there. The wind is still there. And some people will say, you know, he lost his faith, and that's why he started to sink. But he didn't lose his faith, because what did he say? He says, Lord, save me. He does the appropriate thing. He says, Lord, save me. And Jesus reaches out and grabs him and brings him back up. And he says, you have little faith. Why did you doubt? The waves have been there, the water and the wind and everything. Why did you doubt? Now, we can get on Peter's case for losing his faith, and we can say, well, he should, or having his doubts and all that stuff, and we can get on. But here's something that Peter did that a lot of us have yet to do. He got out the boat. A lot of us are happy to just sit in the boat. It doesn't matter how much the boat is rocking or how much the wind is blowing. We're just going to stay right here in the boat. And Jesus says, no, come. Come. There are thousands to feed, not just with earthly food, but with spiritual food. There's another commandment that Jesus gives, not just come, but go and make disciples of all nations. I don't know how you feel about this, but I'll tell you, this just chills me to my core. There was a study that was done, and we call ourselves the Bible Belt. We're in the buckle of the Bible Belt, or maybe that's Nashville. I don't know. We're in the Bible Belt. But here in the Bible Belt, do you know that only 17% of Georgians, 17% of Georgians believe that church or their faith is an important part of their life? So that leaves us. That leaves us with thousands to feed, thousands to bring nourishment to. That has to be the focus and remain the focus, regardless of whatever storms or disruptions or wind is blowing around about us. Whether that's what's going on in the news, what's going on in the media, what's going on even at a special session of General Conference. The mission stays the same. We might say to ourselves, well, you know what, we're only so many of us. We only have this. And we focus on what we have, but we have neglected the most important part, and that is it's not just the material things that we have, but it's the spiritual blessing and fellowship with God, the creator of everything. The same God who created everything that we see and all of that which we cannot see because it is too small, and all the forces that are involved in putting those all together. That is the one who calls us and equips us to feed people who are spiritually starving. But the storms of life, the water, the wind, how can we ever find peace if we don't all agree that we just need to sit still in the boat? I think we've missed the point. A little while ago we sang a hymn. It's a pretty hymn. It's a beautiful hymn. It is well with my soul. How many of y'all know the story behind that hymn? The late 18th, or actually late 19th century, 1872, 73, I don't have the exact year. There was a great fire in Chicago. And Horatio Spafford had lost almost all of his possessions. Almost all of his investments and everything went bad. He still had some business to take care of, but he sent his wife and their 4 daughters on a boat to England, and he was going to meet them a few weeks later. And while that boat was out on its way across the Atlantic Ocean, the wind rose up and the waves rose up and sunk the ship. And sometime later, he received word, I think it may have been through the telegraph at that time, from his wife saying, "All hath perished, except for me." All 4 of their daughters perished in the accident. After his business was concluded, Horatio got on a boat and went back to England. And when they got about to the place where this shipwreck had occurred, he asked the captain to pause and to wait. And while they were there, as he was there in this place where his beautiful daughters had died, all of the words for this great hymn came to me like that. Every last one came to my mind. Whatever my lot, it is well with my soul. Jesus, who can command the waves and the wind, can calm the wind and the waves in our lives. Maybe we need to reach up and say, "Lord, save me." Maybe we need to be like that father whose daughter was ill, and he asked Jesus to save and to heal his daughter if he's willing. He says, "Am I willing? I am willing." And the man says, "Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief." Actually, what he said was, "If you can, heal my daughter. If I can, Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief." Maybe that's where we need to be. Maybe that's what we need to say. Because no matter the winds and the waves, no matter whatever else, we are called to carry the message, to make disciples, to share the news that we have. And so often we take for granted. Sometimes we take it so much for granted, we just kind of go off by ourselves. We so often think we have to take care of ourselves. We have to just tend to our own, and we can't accept help from other people, but we're called to be in community. And when we're called to be in community with each other and with God, great things happen. Great things happen. Let me tell you another story about the same church that had this Thanksgiving dinner. On a good Sunday, we might have 30 or 40 people in worship. On a good Sunday, we would have 30 or 40 people in worship. But when it came time to do the Thanksgiving meal, we had 100 volunteers. People just started showing up. And by the time we left that church, they were serving over 800 Thanksgiving dinners. Faith, understanding who it is that gives us, who equips us truly, who blesses us with everything, who says, use what you have been given and watch me bless it. The one who commands the wind and the waves. It's amazing. These days ahead, as church gathers and picks up a conversation that's been going on for at least 47 years, and tries to make a determination as to who gets to share the message of the gospel and who does not. When we focus on one issue exclusively, and that's not the mission which we have been given, let us be in prayer. Let us be in prayer. Let's not argue about who gets to sit where in the boat. We're all in the boat, and it's rocking. And Jesus is walking and greets us and says, take courage. Take courage. There are good things ahead for each and every one of us. It doesn't matter what's on